This is Fiona Givens. My husband Terryl and I recently sat down in studio with our friend Spencer Fluman, Executive Director of the Neal A. Maxwell Institute at BYU, to talk about ideas and themes from our new book, The Christ Who Heals. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Over the coming months, Terryl Givens will be sitting down with some of the most fascinating and influential people in Mormonism. To watch or listen in on those conversations, please be sure to subscribe to the Conversations with Terryl Givens podcast on iTunes or wherever you access podcasts. You can also visit faithmatters.org and subscribe to this and other fascinating podcasts there.
I'm Spencer Fluman, Executive Director at the Neal A. Maxwell Institute at BYU, and I'm here with my friends, Terryl and Fiona Givens. We're here to talk about some important things. They're the authors of The Christ Who Heals, How God Restored the Truth That Saves Us. Terryl, Fiona, this is a beautiful book.
Thank you, Spencer.
It's a beautiful book. This is not the first book you've co-written together. You wrote The God Who Weeps. You wrote The Crucible of Doubt. What brought about the third?
The question that really guided the writing of this book was, I think, best framed by Fiona when we'd been talking about this for a few years, doing a book on the Christ. And she said, the real question that we need to think about and answer is, what does the Latter-day Saint restoration bring to the table when it comes to the Christ? Because if we really worship the same Christ as the Christian world does, then the whole restoration would have been redundant. If all Joseph was doing was tinkering with the details around the periphery. And so we had to believe, that there have to be some fundamental elements of Christology that were just missing, misunderstood, or distorted, that Joseph Smith set to rights. And so we set about to methodically answer that question. The book took shape.
Give us a little history lesson, would you? Because you start the book with a description of a kind of crisis that divides the Christian community basically in half, between an Eastern half and a Western half. This starts early. It culminates in around 1054 formally. But over these years, a division happens, and you think this is important for Latter-day Saints to understand. It's not just a history lesson. It has to do with the need for the restoration. Tell us about it.
It's absolutely essential that we understand, and I'm not quite sure where I read this, but the mantra for the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and actually for all of Christianity in the East, was that for as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. And it's made very apparent in the liturgy of the Eastern Orthodox Church that it was death and resurrection rather than sin and salvation around which the theology formed. There were missteps right at the get-go. We have Irenaeus, who lived about 200 AD, who the Christians were under attack, literally. And they were accused of worshipping two gods, therefore violating the idea of monotheism. They were worshipping Jesus Christ and the Father. And so as to not collapse into this idea of a plurality of gods, they were forced to save themselves, literally, to adopt the Neoplatonic model of an impassible God and then a God who didn't mind working with matter. But primarily in the East, we find that the early Eastern tradition, we find that the theological discourse resonates so much more with Mormonism than anything in the West, particularly from Augustine on. Would you not agree?
Yeah, and I think that most Latter-day Saints, when they talk about Christianity, what they really mean is Western Christianity, the Western Roman Catholic Church. And so to back up even a little bit from what Fiona was saying, what we were trying to point out, first of all, is that, wait a minute, there were really two Christianities, right? There was the Western and the Eastern tradition. The Eastern tradition has just kind of disappeared mostly from our consciousness in the West. And what we're saying is that the more you plumb the early Christian fathers in the East, you find these incredible resonances and echoes and similarities to Restoration teachings. And so what we find is that to read many of these church fathers like Origen and Irenaeus and the Gregories of Nyssa and Nazianzus is to hear a familiar voice and to recognize that the apostasy took much later to take effect and didn't go as far in the Eastern tradition. And so we really find our kindred spirits in Christianity more in the Eastern Christian tradition than anywhere else.
In fact, it's terribly exciting because some of the quotations and the very positive way in which not only God was viewed, but the possibility of mankind to become like God, there are echoes of Joseph or of the Eastern Church in Joseph to such an extent that some of the quotations from Joseph are almost verbatim. And it is unlikely, at least we've not seen any evidence that Joseph had access to the early Greek texts. And yet it's quite extraordinary how closely aligned the theological thought of early Mormonism and of early Eastern Christianity are meshed.
And you're pointing to what I was hoping for. Think through, both of you, a couple of examples maybe from each of these early church fathers who aren't heard as or recognized in the West. What are these resonances? What are some examples that you could provide for us of kindred spirits that Latter-day Saints might sense in some of these early?
Okay, I'll start with
fathers.
Origen. He's sometimes called the very first theologian or systematic theologian in the church, writing in the first couple of centuries. And he taught, for example, that the spirit of man is eternal, that we lived in a premortal state with God, that we come here for purposes of education. He taught that the fall was part of a divine plan, that sin is more collateral damage than a sign of catastrophic failure of Adam and Eve being in the garden. He taught that God had in mind to find a way to redeem and save the entire human family, and that God would find a way to bring all people back to his immediate presence. He was hugely influential in the first 5 Christian centuries. And then it wasn't until the 6th century that he's declared heretical and anathematized for his teachings on preexistence and on God's generous and inclusive heaven. And Joseph Smith seems almost to be channeling Origen in his teachings on both topics.
And it's interesting that most of Origen's works were destroyed along with anathema. So it's only through one of his disciples that we have these sort of scattered remnants of his thoughts. For me, I've been particularly influenced by Irenaeus. The traditional Western conception of the fall is that it was a tragedy, starting from Augustine onwards, that we were great, marvelous human beings, and then we suffered from this hubris and wanted to become like God, and so we were cast out and we fell, and essentially Christ came in to repair the damage of fallen humanity. Whereas in the East it was very different and very Mormon, in fact. I'd like to quote from Irenaeus because about the experience, particularly of mortality. So he says, "How could mankind have discerned the good without knowing its opposite? For its first-hand experience is more certain and reliable than conjecture. The mind acquires knowledge of the good through the experience of both and becomes more firmly committed to preserving it by obeying God, first by penance, metanoia, change of heart. He rejects disobedience because it is bitter." And that's really struck me because in Moses 6:55, that is exactly how God defines sin. They need to taste the bitter in order to prize the good. I mean, it's extraordinary. And then he talks about this then was the great hardness of God. He allowed humankind to endure all things and to come to know death so that mankind might come to the resurrection from the dead, that humankind might learn by experience what it had been freed from and be always grateful to the Lord. So it's just extraordinary. And the other thing that I think is so important for us is that he recognized that Adam and Eve were young, that they were children in the light of the fact that they didn't understand deception. They'd never been exposed to deception or lies, and that mortality was a season for them to progress. to develop the maturity to return them to be to God in a more godly form than they were in the Garden of Eden.
So this is almost like that familiar spirit speaking out of the dust
Right.
that we usually associate with the Book of Mormon. But we hear that familiar spirit, and it's beautiful because it's so resonant coming from these early Christian fathers of the East.
And I'm struck that what this presents, and for Latter-day Saint readers, is a very, it's a recognizable story in a way. There's something lost here. There's something lost. There's a need for a restoration. It's not like at a certain point you say, well, the lights went out and it's all wreckage after that. What you show is this kind of layered and kind of complicated story of some ideas rising and falling, and others. One of the things you both write that I wonder if you could speak to is that, in a way, you say it's not just that individual doctrines somehow get corrupted, but you say that there's a cosmic context for all sorts of doctrines that gets skewed through these historical processes of some teachings lose out.
Right. Yeah,
So what happened?
This is one of our major ambitions, really, in this book, is we're trying to kind of reset the narrative. We feel that we have been so much raised, indoctrinated in the Protestant heritage that we still think very much in terms of Protestant models and understandings of our place here on earth and the nature of salvation and Christ's role in our lives. And we're saying, no, we've got to scrap all of that. Grace, for example, erupts not on Calvary when Christ decides to right a broken covenant. From a Mormon perspective, grace erupts in the universe when Christ emerges in the pre-existent council in heaven and says, I will step forward and make possible this planned ascent of the human family to godliness. In that context, then, death becomes a necessary part of the process. In fact, it's significant that in the 1851 edition of the Pearl of Great Price, the wording indicates that by the fall of man came human life. That's a paraphrase, but it's not death that's introduced. It's human life, because Adam and Eve's decision makes possible, right, the entry of the entire human family into mortality. And so it recalibrates everything. And instead of seeing Christ's work as an attempt to recuperate an original condition of bliss or righteousness, we see Christ's role as that of shepherding us along a process which was planned from the beginning, is still intact and still unfolding according to his designs. And so that's what we mean about the larger cosmic narrative, understanding that the new and everlasting covenant is a holistic covenant that begins in the premortal councils in heaven and continues until the end of time.
The wonderful thing about Mormons is not so the term Saviors on Mount Zion is not unfamiliar. And I think that's very helpful for what Terryl and I have been exploring in this particular part. But we seldom see ourselves as collaborators, living collaborators with each other. And I understand that in the early church, the baptismal covenants in Mosiah were actually articulated aloud. And I rather wish they still were.
At the time of baptism.
Well, at the time of baptism, because they are so powerful. So for me to have been able to stand and say, I covenant with you that I will carry your burdens. I covenant with you that I will mourn with you when you mourn. I covenant with you that I will comfort when you are in need of comfort. And then we read that as we make these covenants, then we become adopted by Christ. But when we're adopted by Christ, we're adopted by Christ's family. And then when one looks at the three members of the Godhead, they are all there in that covenant. So the God who mourns is the God who weeps, man of holiness, God the Father. The God who carries our burdens is Christ, carrying our sufferings and being the co-sufferer. And the God who comforts is the Holy Spirit. And so for me, this makes this divine plan so much more universal and so much more powerful than any other theology I have encountered.
So that rather than, because we think one of the disasters of Reformation thought was that God becomes sovereign And this is one of Calvin's favorite words,
Yeah,
meaning that he is the author of everything that exists and everything that happens. And Christ increasingly becomes relegated to the role of defending us against the Father's wrath.
Yeah, kind of a buffer.
He's the
Right.
buffer.
Yeah,
He's the
right.
buffer.
Exactly. He's a shield.
Yeah.
And so, as Fiona said, what is so beautiful about Mormon thought is that the three are recuperated into this collaborative entity where they all work together, contributing toward the same end, rather than positing this radical dichotomy where we're protected by Christ from the Father's wrath, which is a terrible way to think about the Father, but it's the God of Jonathan Edwards that in some ways still infiltrates Mormon thinking about judgment and hell.
Which is unfortunate because I think it's so beautifully elaborated in the Pearl of Great Price, in the Book of Moses, and particularly in Abraham, where you have this idea of counsels, and it's emphasized again and again, I think in 2 verses, 4 times, as we counseled, as we counseled, as we counseled. So this idea that Christ and God could not possibly be working against each other. You know, that God is, you know, he's holding us like spiders. He can't wait to throw us all into hell. And Christ is, you know, fighting against his Father desperately to save us. It's
Just today in a class that
perverse.
I was visiting on campus, a student objected to what I was saying, and he said, but Jesus does save me from the Father's wrath. He does protect me from his justice.
Yeah.
And I thought, well,
that is
that's
very,
not my
very,
God.
that's very Protestant, Puritan. And this is what Terryl was saying, is that one of the reasons why we wrote this book is that we feel that we are almost saturated, if not indoctrinated by this Protestant view, because Mormonism was birthed in radically Protestant America.
Yeah, it's the air that they all breathe, right? It's their language.
Exactly, exactly. And I think it's very interesting that very few Catholics joined Mormonism. It was primarily Protestants, and they brought with them, and unfortunately it's still in our sensibilities, this idea of a wrathful, vengeful God, that judgment is something absolutely awful, and that we are going to be separated from those with whom we love the most. When our children are singing in primary, families can be together forever. So I think it creates this dreadful cognitive dissonance, which could easily be displaced if we understood that there was another theology that was much more optimistic, that talked about man's eternal progression to become like God, and that God's continual working with us so that we pass through each schoolroom, rather than this idea of this wrathful, vengeful God who can't wait to deposit us all into some very uncomfortable realm, and Christ acting as a mediator, but failing in the end.
Well, I'm struck too by the way in which you've shown us how a larger kind of restoration frame for understanding some of these doctrines not only kind of positions baptism as adoption. I mean, that this really comes forward, but it also, by emphasizing the collaborative nature of individual divine beings, we actually get a clearer sense of their unity.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
That's
Exactly.
we weren't expecting that emphasis on collaboration and individual kind of identities within the Godhead would end up resolving that problem of pitting the Father and the Son
Right.
against each other in whatever metaphor we want to make of that.